Former senator's son faced an unexpected sentence. After showing No Remorse April 3rd, 2024, 7:32 a.m., the morning air in downtown Austin carried the weight of anticipation, thick and humid even before the sun had fully risen. Outside the Travis County Courthouse, a black Escalade sat idling at the curb, its engine rumbling low and deliberate, a sound that seemed less like machinery and more like a warning. The tinted windows reflected the pale granite steps leading up to the courthouse entrance, but they revealed nothing of the figure inside. For a long moment, the vehicle simply waited, as if daring the world to acknowledge its presence. Then the door opened. Cameron Hargrove stepped out with the kind of ease that only comes from a lifetime of unopened doors and unquestioned access. 28 years old, dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit him like a second skin, he moved with the practiced stride of someone who had never truly faced consequence. Aviator sunglasses obscured his eyes, but his posture spoke volumes. Shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was the son of former Senator Richard Hargrove, a name that had opened boardrooms, secured donations, and quietly buried scandals for decades. Cameron carried that legacy like armor. Reporters had already gathered near the courthouse entrance. Cameras poised, microphones extended. They called his name, voices overlapping in a desperate scramble for a soundbite. Cameron glanced their way, his smirk deepening, and waved them off with a lazy flick of his wrist. Not dismissive exactly, but amused, as if the spectacle were beneath him, a minor inconvenience rather than a reckoning. He adjusted his cufflinks, exchanged a quiet word with his driver, and moved toward the entrance with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided in his favor. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The courthouse corridors were quieter, cooler, the air-conditioned hum doing little to ease the tension already building in Courtroom 5C. Judge Elena Morales sat at her bench, fingers tracing the edges of the case file before her. 2024 TC 8847. The pages were dense with incident reports, witness statements, medical records, and surveillance footage timestamps. She had reviewed the file 3 times already, absorbing every detail with the methodical precision of someone who understood that justice was built on facts, not reputation. Her dark eyes scanned the summary one final time. Reckless driving causing injury, failure to render aid, obstruction of justice. The charges were serious, the evidence was damning, and yet she knew the courtroom she was about to enter would be filled with people expecting her to bend. The doors opened, and Cameron Hargrove entered, flanked by Marcus Whitley, a high-profile defense attorney whose name was synonymous with high-stakes acquittals and expertly crafted legal loopholes. Whitley was in his early 50s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who had never lost a case he truly cared about. He placed a hand lightly on Cameron's shoulder, guiding him toward the defendant's table with the subtle choreography of a man who knew every courtroom was also a stage. Cameron's demeanor was casual, almost bored. He slid into his seat, leaned back, and crossed one leg over the other, his aviator sunglasses still perched on his face despite being indoors. He pulled out his phone, scrolling absently, thumb flicking across the screen with the kind of distraction that suggested he had somewhere more important to be. Whitley leaned in, whispering something low and quick. Cameron's mouth twitched into a grin, brief, controlled, but unmistakable. The attorney suppressed his own smile, adjusting his tie and opening his briefcase with the smooth efficiency of routine. The gallery was filling rapidly. Parents clutched purses and folded arms, their expressions tense and watchful. Journalists lined the back rows, pens poised over notebooks, eyes darting between the defendant and the bench. A few cyclists sat near the front, their presence a quiet solidarity with the victim, whose life had been upended by a single moment of recklessness. The air hummed with anticipation, a collective breath held in wait. Judge Morales lifted her eyes from the case file, her gaze sweeping the courtroom with deliberate calm. She noted the defendant's posture, the attorney's rehearsed confidence, the gallery's barely concealed anger. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable, a wall of principle that no amount of influence could penetrate. She cleared her throat, the sound cutting through the low murmur of voices, and the room fell silent. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady, resonant, carrying the weight of authority earned through years of unwavering integrity. "We are here today to address case number 2024 TC 8847. Mr. Hargrove, please remove your sunglasses and stand." Cameron hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering near the frames. Then slowly he slid them off, revealing eyes that were sharp, calculating, and utterly devoid of remorse. He stood, but the gesture felt perfunctory, as if he were humoring a formality rather than acknowledging authority. Judge Morales held his gaze, unflinching. "In this courtroom, Mr. Hargrove, you are a citizen, not a name, not a legacy, a citizen. Do you understand?" The words hung in the air, precise and unyielding. Cameron's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he masked it with a thin smile. "Yes, Your Honor." But the smirk that followed betrayed him. Privilege had walked into the courtroom expecting deference. What it found instead was a judge who refused to recognize it. Officer Daniel Reyes rose from his seat in the gallery and made his way to the witness stand, his uniform crisp, his posture upright, the bearing of a man who had spent 15 years serving the public with quiet, unwavering integrity. He placed his hand on the Bible, took the oath, and settled into the chair with the calm of someone who had testified dozens of times before. But this time felt different. The weight in the room was heavier, the stakes more personal. He could feel the eyes of the gallery on him, the silent expectation that the truth he was about to speak would cut through the carefully constructed armor of privilege sitting across the courtroom. Judge Morales nodded. "Officer Reyes, please recount the events of February 14th, 2024, beginning at approximately 11:47 p.m. Reyes took a breath, his hands folded on the polished wood of the witness stand. "Valentine's Day night. East 6th Street was packed. Restaurants, food trucks, bars, people everywhere. It's one of the busiest corridors in Austin, especially on a Thursday night. At 11:43 p.m., I was patrolling near the intersection of East 6th and Red River when dispatch radioed in a report of a vehicle traveling at high speed, weaving through traffic. Witnesses described it as a silver Porsche 911. He paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward Cameron, whose expression remained flat, detached, as if the testimony were about someone else entirely. "I responded immediately," Reyes continued. "At 11:46 p.m., I clocked the vehicle on radar at 87 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. The Porsche was weaving between lanes, narrowly missing pedestrians crossing at marked crosswalks. At 11:47:18 p.m., the vehicle struck a bicycle courier, Miguel Santos, age 34, who was traveling eastbound in the designated bike lane." The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like pressure building in a sealed container. Reyes's voice remained steady, but the weight of what he was describing settled over the room like a shroud. The impact threw Mr. Santos approximately 22 feet into the air. He landed on the pavement near the curb. Bystanders immediately began screaming, calling for help. I arrived on scene at 11:51 p.m., 4 minutes after the collision. Mr. Santos was unconscious, bleeding from multiple lacerations, his breathing shallow and irregular. Paramedics were en route, but it was clear the injuries were severe. He turned a page in his notes, though it was obvious he didn't need them. The details were etched into his memory. The Porsche had come to a stop approximately 40 yards ahead of the impact site. The driver, later identified as Cameron Hargrove, was standing outside the vehicle, phone in hand. He was not checking on the victim. He was not calling 911. He was making a call, and based on phone records obtained later, that call was to his father's chief of staff, placed at 11:48 p.m., less than 1 minute after the collision. A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and indignant. Judge Morales glanced toward the audience, her expression firm, and the murmur subsided. When I approached Mr. Hargrove, Reyes said, his tone measured but edged with something harder. His first words to me were not an inquiry about the victim's condition. His first words were, "Do you know who I am?" The room erupted in whispers. Parents in the gallery exchanged glances, their faces tight with disbelief. Cyclists sitting near the front row shook their heads, lips pressed into thin lines. Journalists scribbled furiously, the scratch of pens against paper audible in the tense silence. Judge Morales raised a hand, and the murmurs ceased. "Continue, Officer Reyes." "I identified myself and informed Mr. Hargrove that he was required to submit to a breathalyzer test. He refused. I explained that refusal to comply would result in immediate license suspension and additional charges. His response was to demand that I contact someone higher up. He was dismissive, agitated, and showed no concern for the victim lying injured 40 yards behind him. The prosecutor stood, holding a tablet. "Your Honor, I'd like to present body cam footage from Officer Reyes, recorded at the scene." Judge Morales nodded. "Proceed." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video began to play on the mounted screens. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The timestamp read 11:52 p.m. Officer Reyes's voice came through the audio, calm and professional. "Sir, I need you to step over here and submit to a breathalyzer test." Cameron's voice sharp and dismissive. "I'm not doing that. Do you know who my father is?" "Sir, your father's identity is irrelevant to this traffic stop. You are required by law." "I'm not taking orders from you. Get your supervisor on the phone. Now." The footage continued, showing Cameron pacing, phone still in hand, his movements jerky and impatient. In the background, paramedics could be seen working frantically over Miguel Santos's motionless body. Cameron never looked in that direction, not once. The video ended. The lights came back up. The gallery sat in stunned silence, the kind of silence that carries the weight of collective judgment. Judge Morales's eyes shifted to Cameron, whose face remained impassive, jaw set, arms crossed. He looked bored, as if the footage had been a tedious formality. His attorney, Marcus Whitley, leaned in and whispered something, but Cameron didn't respond. He simply stared forward, refusing to meet the judge's gaze. Officer Reyes cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the stand. Mr. Santos was transported to Del Seaton Medical Center at 12:03 a.m. His injuries included a shattered pelvis, 3 fractured ribs, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding. He underwent emergency surgery and was in critical condition for 72 hours. The prosecutor nodded. "And Mr. Hargrove's behavior at the scene, did it change at any point?" Reyes's jaw tightened. "No. He remained focused on protecting himself. At no point did he ask about the victim's condition. At no point did he express remorse. His only concern was avoiding accountability." The gallery reacted audibly, gasps, murmurs of disgust, the rustling of coats as people shifted in their seats. A woman in the third row whispered to her neighbor, voice tight with anger. "He left a man dying in the street and called his daddy's lawyer." Judge Morales allowed the reaction to settle, then spoke, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Officer Reyes, in your 15 years of service, have you ever encountered a driver involved in a serious collision who refused to render aid or cooperate with law enforcement in this manner?" Reyes met her gaze. "No, Your Honor. This was the most egregious display of indifference I have witnessed." The judge nodded slowly, her eyes shifting once more to Cameron. His expression had not changed. If anything, it had hardened, jaw clenched, eyes cold. A man who believed the world owed him deference, not accountability. The courtroom absorbed the testimony like a body absorbing a wound. Slow, painful, irreversible. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no retreating from it now. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Marcus Whitley rose with the practiced grace of a man who had spent decades turning courtrooms into stages where the law bent to his carefully constructed narratives. He adjusted his cufflinks, straightened the lapels of his charcoal suit, and addressed Judge Morales with the kind of deference that was calculated to flatter without surrendering authority. His voice was smooth, measured, the tone of someone accustomed to winning before the arguments even began. "Your Honor, if I may," he began, holding a slim folder in one hand. "The defense moves to suppress the evidence obtained during the traffic stop on the night of February 14, 2024. We contend that Officer Reyes lacks sufficient probable cause to initiate the stop, that the breathalyzer request was coercive and violated my client's Fourth Amendment rights, and that the entire encounter was conducted in a manner that undermines the integrity of the evidence presented." He paused, letting the words settle, his eyes sweeping briefly across the gallery, as if inviting them to consider the reasonableness of his argument. Cameron sat beside him, arms crossed, chin tilted slightly upward, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He nodded along as Whitley spoke, the gesture casual, almost bored, as if the motion were a formality that would inevitably be granted. Whitley continued, his tone gaining a subtle edge. Officer Reyes clocked my client's vehicle at 87 miles per hour, but the radar calibration records for that night have not been provided to the defense. Without confirmation that the equipment was functioning properly, we cannot accept the speed measurement as accurate. Furthermore, my client's refusal to submit to a breathalyzer test is his constitutional right, and framing that refusal as evidence of guilt is both prejudicial and legally unsound. He turned slightly, gesturing toward Cameron. Mr. Hargrove was in shock following the incident. His behavior, his attempt to contact his family, his questions to the officer, these are the natural responses of someone in distress, not the calculated actions of someone attempting to evade justice. The gallery stirred. A woman in the second row exhaled sharply, the sounds somewhere between disbelief and disgust. A man near the back shook his head slowly, lips pressed into a thin line. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens moving with the urgency of people witnessing something they knew would make headlines. Judge Morales sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the bench, her expression unreadable. She listened without interruption, her dark eyes tracking Whitley's every movement, every calculated pause, every rhetorical flourish. When he finished, she allowed a beat of silence to pass, a deliberate pause that seemed to pull all the air out of the room. Then she spoke, her voice calm, but edged with something harder, something that left no room for misinterpretation. Mr. Whitley, this court operates on evidence, not influence. The words landed like a gavel strike, sharp and final. Whitley's expression flickered, just for a moment, a hairline crack in his polished composure. Judge Morales continued, her tone measured but unyielding. The footage is clear. The injuries are documented. The radar equipment was calibrated and certified in accordance with departmental protocols, records of which were submitted to the defense 3 weeks ago. Officer Reyes had probable cause. Multiple witnesses reported reckless driving, and the vehicle was clocked at more than twice the legal speed limit in a densely populated area. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze shifting from Whitley to Cameron. Procedural fairness applies equally to all citizens, Mr. Whitley. Your client does not occupy a separate legal category. His refusal to cooperate with a lawful breathalyzer request is indeed his right, but it is also a factor this court may consider in the context of his overall behavior at the scene. Cameron's jaw tightened. The smirk faded, replaced by a hardness that settled over his features, like a mask slipping back into place. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, a subtle betrayal of tension. He leaned toward Whitley, muttering something under his breath, his voice low and sharp. Whitley's hand moved almost imperceptibly, a small gesture meant to signal restraint, but Cameron's expression remained tight, irritation flickering in his eyes. Judge Morales' voice cut through the tension. Wealth, family name, and political connections do not exempt anyone from accountability. The law does not recognize privilege as a defense. Your motion is denied. The courtroom exhaled collectively, a quiet release of tension that rippled through the gallery like a breeze through tall grass. Some nodded in quiet approval, their faces reflecting a cautious hope that justice might, in fact, prevail. Others simply stared, absorbing the moment, the weight of what had just been said settling into their bones. Cameron's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed, his lips parted as if he were about to speak, and then he caught himself, clamping his jaw shut with visible effort. The flicker of irritation that crossed his face was unmistakable. A crack in the armor of entitlement, a brief glimpse of the man beneath the practiced indifference. Whitley shifted in his seat, his hand moving to adjust the papers in front of him, a gesture meant to project calm, but undermined by the tightness in his shoulders. He cleared his throat, nodded once, and said, "Understood, Your Honor." But the damage was done. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Privilege had walked in expecting deference, and it had been met with principle. The collision was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time, witnessed and weighed by every eye in the room. Judge Morales's gaze lingered on Cameron for a moment longer, her expression calm but insistent, a silent reminder that this courtroom would not be swayed by reputation or influence. Then she turned her attention to the prosecutor, her voice steady as she said, "We will proceed with the presentation of evidence." Judge Morales reached for a slim manila folder, resting at the edge of her bench, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The courtroom had settled into a tense quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents with the precision of someone who had already memorized every line, but understood the importance of letting the evidence speak for itself. When she looked up, her gaze swept across the courtroom, pausing briefly on Cameron before addressing the room. "The court will now review a series of communications obtained through subpoena," she said, her voice steady, each word weighted with authority. "These documents reveal the actions taken by the defendant and his associates in the hours and days following the incident on February 14, 2024. She lifted the first document, holding it so the gallery could see the letterhead, though the words were too small to read from that distance. "This is an email sent at 1:14 a.m. on February 15, 2024, approximately 90 minutes after the collision, from an aide to former Senator Richard Hargrove to a liaison within the Austin Police Department. It reads in part, 'We are aware of the unfortunate incident involving Cameron Hargrove. The family is deeply concerned and hopes this matter can be handled with appropriate discretion. We trust the department will act with the professionalism we have come to expect.'" She set the document down, her expression unreadable, and reached for another. "This is a text message sent from Cameron Hargrove's phone at 12:03 a.m. on February 15th to a family attorney named Lawrence Kincaid. It reads, 'Fix this quietly, no media.'" The message was sent before emergency services were contacted. A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and sharp, the sound of collective disbelief. A woman in the second row leaned toward her neighbor, whispering something urgent, her face tight with anger. A man near the back folded his arms, shaking his head slowly, his jaw clenched. Judge Morales continued, her tone calm but relentless. "Phone records show that Mr. Hargrove placed a call to his father's office at 11:48 p.m., less than 1 minute after the collision. That call lasted 2 minutes and 17 seconds. A call to 911 was not placed until 11:56 p.m., 8 minutes later, and it was made not by Mr. Hargrove, but by a bystander at the scene." The gallery reacted audibly now, whispers escalating into murmurs, the tension in the room thickening like humidity before a storm. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against paper. Parents exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from disbelief to outrage. Judge Morales lifted her gaze to Officer Reyes, who sat in the witness box, his hands folded, his face grim. "Officer Reyes, you testified earlier about your encounter with Mr. Hargrove at the scene. I'd like you to address a phone call you received 48 hours after the incident. Can you describe that call?" Reyes nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. On the morning of February 17th, I received a call from Deputy Chief Gregory Thorne. He asked me to meet him in his office. When I arrived, he told me that the Hargrove family had been very generous to the department over the years. Donations to law enforcement charities, support during election cycles. He suggested that the case be handled with sensitivity and that we consider whether all charges were truly necessary." The courtroom erupted. Gasps punctuated the murmurs, voices rising in disbelief. A parent in the third row muttered loud enough to be heard, "They tried to bury it." Another voice, quieter but edged with fury, added, "Of course they did." Judge Morales raised a hand, and the room fell silent, though the tension remained, coiled and ready to spring. Officer Reyes continued, his voice steady but laced with something harder. "I told Deputy Chief Thorne that I had a duty to report the facts as I observed them, and that any attempt to minimize the severity of the incident would compromise the integrity of the investigation." He didn't press the issue further, but the implication was clear. This was a family with influence, and I was being asked to exercise discretion. Judge Morales nodded slowly, her gaze shifting back to the documents in front of her. She lifted another email, this one printed on official departmental letterhead. This is an email sent from Deputy Chief Thorne to a senior prosecutor on February 18, 2024. It reads, "Let's keep this low profile. The family has been generous, and we owe them professional courtesy. I trust we can handle this without unnecessary publicity." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, their weight settling over the courtroom like a shroud. Then she looked directly at Cameron, her eyes hard, unyielding. "Professional courtesy," she said, her voice quiet but edged with steel, "is not a shield for recklessness. It is a betrayal of public trust. It is the erosion of the very principle that this legal system was built to uphold, that all citizens, regardless of wealth or status, are equal before the law." Cameron's face flushed, the color rising from his neck to his cheeks, a visible betrayal of the composure he had worked so hard to maintain. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, and for the first time since the proceedings began, his mask cracked, not into remorse but into barely concealed anger. His jaw clenched, his breathing quickened, and his eyes burned with a fury that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with indignation. How dare she, his expression seemed to say. How dare this courtroom treat him like everyone else? Marcus Whitley leaned in quickly, whispering something urgent, his hand moving to Cameron's arm in a gesture meant to calm, to restrain. But Cameron shook his head, a sharp, almost violent motion, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. Judge Morales' gaze did not waver. "The court has reviewed extensive evidence of a coordinated effort to minimize accountability, to leverage influence, and to subvert justice. These actions do not reflect the behavior of someone who made a mistake and sought to make it right. They reflect a calculated attempt to place one individual above the law." The gallery absorbed her words in silence, the kind of silence that feels like the moment before thunder. The evidence was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, documented, undeniable. And the web of influence that had been spun in the shadows was now exposed, laid bare under the unforgiving light of accountability. Cameron sat rigid, his composure fractured, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The power he had once wielded with such ease now felt like chains. The afternoon light filtering through the courtroom windows had softened, casting long shadows across the polished wood and marble. The tension that had been building all morning reached a new threshold as the bailiff called the next witness. Miguel Santos entered slowly, wheeled in by a court attendant, his movements careful and labored. He was 34 years old, but the pain etched into his features made him seem older, as though the months since the collision had aged him in ways no calendar could measure. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his hands resting in his lap, fingers interlaced as if holding himself together. His wife, Elena, followed closely behind, her hand briefly touching his shoulder as she took a seat in the front row of the gallery. Their two daughters sat beside her, Sophia, 6, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, and Maria, 9, her eyes wide and solemn, old beyond her years. The gallery shifted, the atmosphere thickening with anticipation and sorrow. Parents in the rows behind the Santos family leaned forward, their faces tight with empathy. Journalists, who had been scribbling furiously all morning, paused, pens hovering over notebooks, as if recognizing that what was about to happen required silence, not documentation. Judge Morales' voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Santos, thank you for being here today. Please take your time." Miguel nodded, his throat working as he swallowed. When he spoke, his voice was soft, steady, but weighted with a pain that no amount of time would fully erase. "I was delivering food that night. It was Valentine's Day. I had 3 more orders to finish before I could go home to my family. I was in the bike lane, doing everything right. I saw the headlights, just for a second, and then I didn't see anything." He paused, his eyes distant, as if replaying the moment frame by frame. The sound, I'll never forget it. Metal against bone. And then I was in the air. It felt like flying, but wrong. And then nothing. Just silence. His voice cracked slightly, and he took a breath, composing himself. "I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. My wife was there. My daughters were there. Sophia asked me when I could play with her again. And I didn't know how to answer. I still don't. The courtroom absorbed his words in a silence so complete, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Elena's hand covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. Sophia buried her face in the stuffed rabbit, her small shoulders trembling. Judge Morales' voice was quiet, respectful. Thank you, Mr. Santos. Mrs. Santos, would you like to address the court? Elena rose slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand as she steadied herself. Her voice trembled at first, but there was a strength beneath it, a resilience born of months of fear and uncertainty. We lost our income for 4 months. Miguel couldn't work. We couldn't pay rent. We had to borrow money from family just to buy groceries. The hospital bills, they're still coming. She paused, her gaze shifting to Cameron, who sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face unreadable. But the worst part isn't the money. It's watching my daughters be afraid every time their father leaves the house. It's seeing Sophia wake up at night, crying, asking if daddy is going to die. It's knowing that the man who did this to us walked away without a scratch, without a word, without even looking back. Her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. We're still here. We're still fighting. But we shouldn't have to be. Judge Morales nodded, her expression somber. Thank you, Mrs. Santos. There was a pause, and then the judge's gaze shifted to the front row. Sophia Santos, would you like to speak? The little girl looked up at her mother, who nodded gently, squeezing her hand. Sophia stood, still clutching the stuffed rabbit, and walked slowly to the witness stand. A court clerk adjusted the microphone downward so it was closer to her height. Sophia's voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper, fragile and trembling. I thought Daddy was going to die. The courtroom seemed to contract, every person in the room leaning in, straining to hear. Parents in the gallery wiped their eyes. A journalist in the back row set down his pen, his face pale. Even the bailiff, a stoic veteran of countless trials, looked down, his jaw tight. Sophia's wide, anxious eyes moved across the courtroom, landing finally on Cameron. Why didn't the man who hurt him say sorry? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. It was the kind of question only a child could ask, unfiltered, unguarded, cutting straight to the moral heart of the matter. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present. Judge Morales turned her gaze to Cameron, her eyes steady, unflinching. Mr. Hargrove, a child has asked you a question. Do you have an answer? Cameron sat frozen, his face a mask of stone. No flicker of empathy, no shift in posture, no softening of his expression. His jaw remained clenched, his hands flat on the table, his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, refusing to meet Sophia's gaze. The silence stretched, seconds becoming an eternity, and still he said nothing. Marcus Whitley leaned in, whispering urgently, his hand hovering near Cameron's arm as if to nudge him into action. But Cameron did not move. He sat, unyielding, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Sophia's face crumpled. Her mother rose quickly, moving to the witness stand and gathering her daughter into her arms. Elena's eyes, filled with tears and fury, locked onto Cameron for one long, searing moment before she guided Sophia back to their seats. Judge Morales' voice when she spoke was quiet, but edged with something harder, something that left no room for misinterpretation. Let the record show that the defendant declined to respond. The courtroom exhaled collectively, a quiet release of tension that felt less like relief and more like resignation. The truth had been spoken, the question had been asked, and the silence that answered it said everything that needed to be said. Marcus Whitley rose once more, his movements measured, his expression calm despite the emotional weight that had settled over the courtroom. He had built a career on reframing narratives, on turning courtrooms into stages where perception mattered as much as evidence. And now, with his client's reputation and freedom hanging in the balance, he attempted to do what he did best, shift the lens. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth, almost sympathetic. While the court has heard deeply moving testimony from the Santos family, we must be careful not to conflate emotion with legal culpability. Mr. Santos's injuries, while regrettable, have been portrayed in a manner that may exaggerate their severity and permanence. Medical records indicate that he has made significant progress in physical therapy, and the financial hardship described, while unfortunate, is not uncommon in cases involving temporary disability. A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and incredulous. A woman in the third row shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. A man near the front folded his arms, his jaw clenched, his eyes boring into Whitley with barely concealed contempt. Whitley continued, undeterred. Furthermore, my client's silence in response to the child's question should not be interpreted as guilt or indifference. Courtrooms are high-pressure environments, and Mr. Hargrove was simply exercising his right not to speak without the guidance of counsel. Judge Morales's expression remained neutral, but her eyes were sharp, tracking every word. Mr. Whitley, the court will determine what constitutes appropriate interpretation. Proceed with your examination. Whitley nodded, turning toward Cameron. The defense calls Cameron Hargrove to the stand. Cameron stood slowly, his movements stiff, reluctant. He had not wanted to testify, had in fact resisted it until the prosecution made it clear that his silence would be noted. He walked to the witness stand with the same measured stride he had used entering the courtroom that morning, but now there was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his mouth that betrayed the composure he was trying so hard to maintain. The prosecutor, a woman named Rachel Diaz, rose from her seat, her expression calm but resolute. She had been watching Cameron all day, noting every flicker of irritation, every dismissive gesture, every moment of detachment, and now she had the opportunity to confront him directly. Mr. Hargrove, she began, her voice steady, on the night of February 14, 2024, you were driving a Porsche 911 at 87 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. Is that correct? Cameron shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. It was an accident. I didn't intend to hurt anyone. That wasn't my question. Were you driving at 87 miles per hour? He hesitated, then said, his voice flat, I don't remember exactly. Maybe I was going faster than I should have been. Diaz's eyes narrowed. You don't remember exactly, but you do remember calling your father's office within 1 minute of the collision. You remember texting your attorney to fix this quietly? You remember those details, don't you? Cameron's face flushed, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. I was in shock. I called my family for help. That's what anyone would do. Is it? Diaz's voice was sharp now, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Is calling your father's chief of staff what anyone would do? Or is calling 911 to help the man you just hit what anyone would do? The gallery reacted audibly, murmurs swelling into something closer to anger. A man in the back row stood slightly, his voice rising above the noise. He doesn't care. The bailiff moved quickly, raising a hand, and the man sat down. But the damage was done. The sentiment had been spoken aloud, and it hung in the air, undeniable. Diaz pressed on. Mr. Hargrove, do you feel remorse for what happened to Miguel Santos? Cameron paused, his eyes darting briefly toward his attorney, who gave a subtle nod. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. I regret the situation. The words landed like stones in still water, their ripples spreading across the courtroom. Diaz repeated them slowly, deliberately. The situation, not your actions, not the choices you made. The situation. Cameron's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring slightly. Yes. Do you understand the difference, Mr. Hargrove, between regretting a situation and taking responsibility for your actions? He said nothing, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Judge Morales leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. Mr. Hargrove, this court is not interested in regret for situations. We are interested in accountability for actions. Do you understand the difference? Cameron's gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out, his hands gripping the edge of the stand until his knuckles turned white. Yes, Your Honor. But his eyes told a different story. There was no recognition in them, no softening, no hint of genuine understanding. Only resentment, only the barely concealed fury of someone who believed he was being judged unfairly, who could not comprehend why his name, his family, his influence were not enough to shield him. Judge Morales held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, her voice calm but firm. "You may step down." Cameron rose, his movements stiff, and returned to the defendant's table. The courtroom watched him in silence, the weight of his words, and his lack of words, settling over the room like a shroud. The mask of privilege had slipped further, revealing not remorse, but resistance, not accountability, but entitlement. And everyone in that courtroom could see it. The courtroom was hushed, the tension thick enough to taste, as the clock nudged toward 10 a.m. April sunlight streamed through tall, dust-flecked windows, illuminating the stern features of Judge Morales. The air was a mixture of anticipation and dread. Families leaned forward, their hands clasped tight, knuckles white. Journalists scribbled furiously, microphones poised like instruments of truth. The Santos family sat rigid, their eyes fixed on the defendant, Cameron Hargrove, who sat across the room exuding a confidence that seemed impervious until now. Judge Morales adjusted her robe, a deliberate gesture that commanded attention. Her voice, calm but resolute, cut through the low murmur like a blade. "Mr. Hargrove, this court finds you guilty of reckless driving, causing serious bodily injury, failure to render aid, and obstruction of justice." Each word landed deliberately, the weight of the verdict pressing into every chest. A ripple of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Some nodded in relief, others exchanged incredulous glances. Whitley, Hargrove's attorney, shot up, his voice sharp and urgent. "Your Honor, the sentence—" Judge Morales raised a hand, halting him mid-sentence. The silence was immediate and absolute. "Discussions on the verdict's propriety are noted, Mr. Whitley, but will be heard elsewhere. Today, we address the sentence." She leaned slightly forward, her eyes locking on Hargrove. "You will serve 18 months in county jail, with the possibility of work release after 6 months, contingent upon your full participation in a restorative justice program." The words reverberated in the room. The gallery shifted, some leaning forward as though to catch the next blow. The courtroom erupted. Half the people gasped, some nodded in approval, others muttered in shock, their voices a chaotic chorus of disbelief. Hargrove remained still, his usual smug composure faltering. A tremor ran through his hand as he gripped the edge of the table. His breathing, controlled and measured for months, now betrayed him. Judge Morales' gaze did not waver. "Additionally, you will pay restitution in the amount of $250,000 to the Santos family, covering medical expenses, lost wages, and ongoing therapy. You will complete 500 hours of community service with trauma recovery organizations and victim advocacy groups. Finally, your driver's license is suspended for 5 years." Each sentence landed like a measured strike. The Santos family's mother, Maria, pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking back tears, while her husband's knuckles whitened as he gripped the pew in front of him. The air was electric with unspoken tension, the kind that makes hearts pound and voices falter. Judge Morales paused, letting each consequence sink in, giving space for the enormity of the moment to settle. Then she delivered the directive that seemed to pierce Hargrove to his core. "You will also participate in a mandatory restorative justice circle with the Santos family, facilitated by a trained mediator, where you will listen, without defense, without justification, to the full impact of your actions." For the first time, Hargrove's carefully constructed armor cracked, his face drained of color. His hands, once steady and commanding, trembled as they clutched the polished wood of the defense table. He swallowed hard, his lips parting slightly as if to protest, but no words came. Fear, cold, invasive, inescapable, took hold where arrogance once reigned. Cameron's mind raced. He thought of the months he had spent insulated by wealth and influence, of every moment he had believed he could bend consequences to his will. And now none of that mattered. The judge's words struck with a precision that exposed not just his actions, but the moral vacuum he had relied upon as a shield. "Privilege is not immunity," Morales continued, her tone unwavering. "Power does not negate responsibility. This sentence reflects not just punishment, but the opportunity for transformation. Whether you seize that opportunity is up to you." The courtroom exhaled collectively. Maria Santos's eyes met Hargrove's, a mixture of relief, pain, and quiet triumph. Her voice trembled as she whispered to her husband, "It's finally real. He has to face it." Hargrove's internal world, once filled with certainty and entitlement, became a storm of tension and calculation. He thought of the county jail, of community service with people who had suffered far more than he could imagine, of restorative justice circles where he could not hide behind lawyers or money. The future he had taken for granted now seemed fragile, uncertain, defined by accountability rather than privilege. Whitley's protestations had died in the charged silence. Even he recognized, if only subconsciously, that the court had shifted beyond negotiation. Every syllable from Morales was final, each one carrying moral weight that could not be argued away. Judge Morales's gaze swept the room one last time, lingering on the defendant. Her presence filled the space, a quiet but unyielding authority. The gallery absorbed the moment, knowing that justice had not only been pronounced but felt, viscerally, irreversibly. As the gavel descended, the sound reverberated through the chamber, resonating in the hearts of every witness, victim, and observer. It was not merely a strike of law, but a declaration that accountability cannot be sidestepped, that the consequences of choice are inexorable, that the powerful are not beyond the reach of moral reckoning. Hargrove slumped slightly in his chair, eyes downcast, his mind a labyrinth of fear, disbelief, and reluctant comprehension. Outside, the city waited, indifferent to the echoes within this courtroom, yet forever changed by what had transpired inside these walls. The chapter of judgment had closed, but the path toward transformation had just begun. The room began to stir quietly as officers approached to escort Hargrove, whispers rippling across the gallery. But the echo of Morales's words lingered. The law may punish, but it also offers the mirror of conscience. And in that mirror, every choice, every privilege, every failing is laid bare. The morning air in Austin was thick with humidity, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and asphalt baking under the early May sun. Cameron Hargrove arrived at the Austin Trauma Recovery Center, dressed in a plain white t-shirt and faded jeans, a deliberate shedding of the tailored suits and polished shoes that had defined him for so long. For the first time in months, he was just a man walking into a world that did not bend to his privilege. The center's brick facade and modest parking lot were unassuming, almost ordinary, but inside stories waited. Some raw, some searing, all demanding to be confronted. The first weeks were punishing in ways Cameron had never known. Intake paperwork stretched endlessly before him, a litany of names, dates, and injuries. Survivors recounted assaults, accidents, and betrayals with voices that trembled or snapped with anger. Cameron listened, silent, his jaw tight, his hands folded over one another, as if to restrain a part of himself that wanted to flee. Group therapy sessions were even worse. Voices, raw and jagged, carried confessions of fear and pain, and he could not shield himself behind arrogance or denial. Each narrative was a mirror, reflecting back the consequences of his own recklessness, and each reflection left him uncomfortable, rigid, uncertain how to react. Staff members watched him with quiet skepticism. The volunteers whispered to each other in hushed tones, noting his posture, his silence, the way he flinched when someone recounted the exact type of accident he had caused. Survivors, too, kept their distance, their eyes wary, their gestures small but firm, creating an invisible barrier around him. Cameron felt the weight of their judgment, though it was mostly unspoken. Every glance, every sideways acknowledgement reminded him that this world did not owe him leniency. By mid-June, a shift began, subtle at first. He was assigned to work with Jake, a 16-year-old boy who had lost his leg in a hit and run. Jake was angry, withdrawn, a fortress of resentment and fear, and he refused to participate in therapy. Cameron's task was simple in theory: be present. Sit with Jake during physical therapy, help with schoolwork, offer no advice, no platitudes, just the constancy of presence. The first few sessions were excruciatingly silent, punctuated only by the scraping of braces against linoleum and the quiet shuffle of papers. Cameron's discomfort was palpable, Yet for the first time, he felt a responsibility that could not be delegated to others, a duty that rested entirely on his own willingness to endure. Week after week, Jake began to speak cautiously, in fragments at first. He spoke of the nightmares, of phantom pain where his leg once was, of the fear that gripped him at every crosswalk. Cameron listened, truly listened. He did not offer solutions. He did not try to redirect. He did not excuse himself. He absorbed the words like a sponge, letting them settle deep within him, the reality of his actions pressing against every pretense he had ever maintained. One afternoon after a particularly difficult session, where Jake had screamed in frustration and tears had streaked his dusty cheeks, the boy asked quietly, almost tentatively, "Why are you here?" Cameron hesitated. For a moment, the armor of habit, the instinct to deflect, to smooth over, to charm, flickered and died. Then he answered quietly, honestly, "Because I hurt someone, and I didn't understand what that meant until now." Jake's dark eyes studied him for a long moment. "Do you understand now?" Cameron's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm starting to." By August, Cameron had become a fixture at the center. He arrived early, stayed late, coordinated events, offered help wherever it was needed. Survivors who had once avoided him now greeted him by name, a cautious acknowledgement that he was no longer simply a symbol of harm, but a man attempting, imperfectly, to reconcile with the consequences of his actions. He began facilitating workshops on accountability, speaking about his own failings with a raw honesty that left participants both uncomfortable and engaged. He did not claim redemption. He did not seek absolution. He offered only truth, and in that truth, others saw the possibility of change. October arrived, and with it, the restorative justice circle with the Santos family. Cameron sat across from Miguel, Elena, and their daughters, the room heavy with unspoken tension. For 2 hours he listened, uninterrupted, absorbing the weight of their words, their pain, their fear. When invited to speak, he leaned forward slightly, hands clasped tightly, voice low and measured. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back the months of pain, the fear, the financial hardship. But I can promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be someone who doesn't cause that kind of harm again." Miguel studied him long and carefully, the silence stretching, laden with judgment and reflection. Finally he nodded. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. Recognition that Cameron had begun the long, difficult journey toward understanding the consequences of his actions, and perhaps one day toward moral repair. The atmosphere in the room softened slightly, though the scars remained visible in every glance, every careful gesture. Cameron felt the weight of responsibility, the responsibility of memory, of suffering, of trust rebuilt over time. He understood, as he had never understood before, that change is not instantaneous, that healing is measured in persistence and attention, and that every day of effort is a quiet rebuke of the arrogance that once defined him. Walking home later that evening, the humid Texas air clinging to his skin, Cameron reflected on the months he had endured. The center had become more than a site of service. It had become a mirror of conscience, a space where his privilege could not shield him from truth. Each interaction, each patient, each story had chipped away at the walls he had built, leaving a man both more vulnerable and more awake. The work was far from over. He knew that. He could still falter, still retreat into old defenses. But for the first time, he felt an earnest desire not to. And in the quiet, as the city hummed around him, Cameron understood that this was the long road back, not just to accountability, not just to society, but to himself. Every step forward would be measured, imperfect, painful, yet necessary. Every step would be a test, a chance to act differently, to listen, to bear witness. And perhaps in that willingness to face what he had done, he might finally glimpse what it truly meant to transform. By November, the story of Cameron Hargrove's reckoning had transcended the walls of the courtroom, rippling outward into the very fabric of Austin. The Hargrove case became a fixture at the University of Texas School of Law, dissected in seminars with hushed intensity, debated by students poring over transcripts, and analyzed in papers questioning the intersection of privilege, justice, and accountability. Professors did not frame it as an anomaly or a stroke of moral luck. They presented it as a blueprint, a case study in how structured consequences can catalyze reflection and transformation. In classrooms, the question echoed again and again. When power meets responsibility, what happens if the two are held in equal measure? Local advocacy groups adopted the case as an emblem of restorative justice realized, not as leniency, but as rigorous accountability paired with opportunity for change. Panels convened, survivors spoke, and activists cited the sentence, the restitution, and Cameron's community service as evidence that the law could do more than punish. It could teach. It could provoke empathy, even in someone who had spent a lifetime insulated by wealth and entitlement. The Santos family, once ensnared in fear and financial instability, felt the tangible effects of justice fulfilled. With the restitution funds, Miguel and Elena relocated their family to a quieter, safer neighborhood. The girls were enrolled in schools with more resources, their classrooms filled not with uncertainty, but possibility. Miguel's body, marked by scars and slow-healing fractures, underwent additional surgery, improving mobility and granting him the small but profound dignity of independence. He began working part-time as a courier dispatcher, the rhythm of a structured day offering him a sense of agency he had feared lost forever. Elena, ever the quiet force beside him, channeled her own trauma into advocacy, founding a support group for families affected by reckless driving, a space where grief could meet guidance and loss could find meaning. Meanwhile, Cameron's presence in the public eye shifted from scandal to cautionary tale. Local media chronicled his progress, not with salacious headlines, but as a study in the arc from entitlement to empathy. Journalists documented his hours at the Austin Trauma Recovery Center, capturing these subtle transformations. The way he greeted survivors by name, the attentive posture he maintained during therapy sessions, the quiet diligence with which he organized community events. Interviews with staff highlighted the contrast between the man who had once walked into court with arrogance and the man who now sat in meeting rooms, coordinating support groups with careful patience. One survivor reflected, voice steady despite lingering scars. He's not perfect, but he listens, and sometimes that's the first step toward real change. Public opinion, once seething with outrage, softened into a cautious respect. Editorials framed the case in moral, almost philosophical terms. One in particular read, "Justice is not just punishment, it is the opportunity for change, rigorously enforced and patiently observed." The piece lingered on the restorative justice circle, the measurable consequences, and the commitment Cameron had demonstrated. Proof that accountability need not be hollow, and that even those steeped in privilege could confront their impact on others. By December, Cameron had completed his 500 hours of community service. Work release ended, but he did not return to his former life. The sweets, the business meetings, the hollow victories. Instead, he accepted a full-time position as a volunteer coordinator at the trauma center, dedicating himself entirely to supporting survivors. The shift was more than symbolic. It was deliberate, a daily choice to confront the consequences of his actions through service, empathy, and consistency. He became a fixture in the center's hallways, a presence whose past missteps were neither erased nor ignored, but whose ongoing commitment demonstrated that transformation is a process, measured not in absolution but in sustained effort. Even Cameron's family was touched by the gravity of accountability. Richard Hargrove, once the man whose wealth and influence had insulated his son from consequence, issued a public statement acknowledging his own failures. He admitted to having enabled patterns of entitlement, promising to support criminal justice reform initiatives and to examine how privilege can obscure moral responsibility. The words modest yet weighty were a testament that change can extend beyond one individual, rippling into systems, into communities, into the hearts of those who wield influence. The community itself began to feel the effects of this transformation. Conversations about responsibility deepened, extending into schools, workplaces, and social circles. Advocacy groups noted increased engagement, inspired by the visibility of consequences, coupled with the possibility of redemption. Conversations that had been theoretical now had real-life reference points. A man of privilege confronting the harm he had caused, a family rebuilding from fear, a community witnessing a moral arc play out in tangible terms. The case no longer belonged solely to Cameron or the Santos family. It belonged to the city of Austin, to anyone who would confront the quiet intersections of power, action, and accountability. Cameron understood the weight of the work he had chosen. Each day brought reminders of the fragility of trust, of the care required to repair what had been broken. Survivors did not always welcome him. Some remained distant, their anger and caution justified, and yet he showed up. He listened. He organized, coordinated, and slowly began to inhabit a space that demanded humility and presence. In the quiet hours of the trauma center, he reflected on the contrast between his past and present life, aware that transformation is neither linear nor complete, but also aware that it was possible, visible, and necessary. The ripple effect extended beyond the center's walls. Families found courage to advocate for safer streets. Law students debated ethics with newfound depth. Journalists chronicled the slow arc of human accountability. The community, shaped by observation and action, began to grasp a fundamental truth. Justice, when paired with reflection and effort, can reshape not only individuals, but the moral landscape of a city. In Austin, the story of Cameron Hargrove became more than a cautionary tale. It became a testament to what it means to confront harm, to witness transformation, and to allow accountability to extend outward, like ripples in water, reaching far beyond a single moment, a single family, a single courtroom. Judge Elena Morales sat alone in her chambers, the soft hum of the heater mingling with the muted city sounds filtering through the blinds. The December light fell at a low angle, casting long shadows across her desk, where the final report on Cameron Hargrove's compliance rested. She flipped the pages slowly, absorbing each entry. The hours logged at the trauma center, the workshops facilitated, the restorative justice sessions completed. It was not a story of spectacle, nor one of sudden redemption. It was a story of steady, relentless, painstaking work. Cameron had transformed, not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small, deliberate choices that revealed a man learning to reckon with the consequences of his actions. Morales leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced, and reflected on the principle that had guided her sentencing. Justice, she reminded herself, was never about revenge. Punishment without purpose was cruelty. Unchecked leniency was negligence. Her goal had been to hold Cameron accountable in a way that allowed him to see, feel, and comprehend the human cost of his recklessness. She remembered the courtroom that April morning, the tension thick as a storm cloud. Cameron had sat across from the Santos family, confident, untouchable, certain that wealth and influence insulated him from the moral weight of his choices. Now, months later, that confidence had been stripped away, replaced with something harder and quieter: humility. The report chronicled his months of daily presence, listening without defense, responding without avoidance. It described how he had sat with Jake, a boy who had lost a leg, absorbing his rage and fear, how he had returned again and again to the center, helping survivors with no expectation of reward or recognition. Morales considered the courage it had taken, not the court-mandated courage that only threatened consequences, but the deeper, voluntary courage to confront one's own failings consistently without flinching. The Santos family, she noted, had also found a measure of peace. Miguel moved with steadier confidence after surgery, able to manage the routines of daily life and return to part-time work. His daughters no longer flinched at the wail of sirens, no longer recoiled from the shadows that had haunted them for months. Elena had reclaimed a sense of safety she had feared lost forever, channeling grief into advocacy for families like her own. Morales smiled faintly as she read Elena's notes on the support group she had founded, a space for collective healing, built on the example of accountability she had witnessed. Cameron's transformation, she thought, was imperfect. He still hesitated at times, still struggled with the instinct to retreat into self-protection. But the work had begun. He had begun to listen, truly, to the lives he had affected. He had begun to absorb the weight of consequences and translate it into action. And in that, Morales saw something rare. Not the erasure of past harm, but the emergence of moral responsibility where before, there had been privilege, entitlement, and denial. She reached for her pen and scribbled in the margin. Accountability without opportunity for change is cruelty. Opportunity without accountability is negligence. Justice requires both. The words resonated in the quiet of the chambers, a reminder that the law's purpose extends beyond punishment. It is an instrument for reflection, learning, and transformation. Morales remembered the faces in her courtroom, the Santos family, their daughters watching every gesture, every syllable. Cameron, the man who had believed he was untouchable. She remembered the silence after her gavel fell, the tension that lingered, and the subtle shift that came when consequences were met with consistency and moral clarity.